Chapter 2, the problem, the heart of the research problem. In this chapter, we'll discuss how you identify a research problem that you might be interested in studying yourself. As we spoke about in Chapter 1, you will be developing a research proposal of your own. You can decide whether or not you actually carry out the research. That won't be the subject of this particular course. But if you do need to carry out a thesis, that might be something that you want to, or a dissertation, something you might want to think about. Regardless, in this class we will be developing a research proposal, and each of your assignments 1, 2, and 3, will be cumulative in nature, building upon one another. I'll give you feedback, and then it'll help you as you develop your entire research proposal by assignment 3. So let's talk a little bit more about how we identify a research problem to begin with. The research projects can be one of two types, so this might be something to think about as well. Do you want to propose a basic research or applied research? And we'll talk about each of those in turn. Basic research. For basic research, we're talking about research that's just to help us understand a phenomenon of interest. So it enhances our basic knowledge of the physical world or the biological world, psychological world, social world. And primarily in our area in education and psychology and education, perhaps some of you are in drug and alcohol abuse studies or special education administration or higher ed or curriculum and instruction. I know you come from a variety of different backgrounds. But primarily, I think most of you are looking at the psychological world or the social world. I've had some students who have gone more into depth in the physical and biological, in kinesiology, for example. I've had some students work through that. But I think for most of you, you're going to look at some problems trying to understand the psychological or the social world. So think about, within your discipline, which of these areas does it lean more towards, and what exactly do we want to better understand? Applied research, so basic research, we're just trying to understand something about the world, okay? Applied research, on the other hand, we're actually trying to address an issue. So not only do we want to understand some phenomenon of interest, that was with basic research, with applied research, we want to solve some type of perhaps problem that we have. So it addresses issues that have immediate relevance to current practices, procedures, and policies. Human decision-making about practical problems, questions in one immediate work environment. So for example, let's say we want to, we're thinking about investing some money into iPads for a school. Okay, this might be applied research. I'm a principal, and I got a grant, and now I'm trying to decide what to do with this money, and I want to have the most effective use of it. So maybe I'd take a sample and just buy, 20 iPads and do some research and to see if it enhances in student performance, student engagement, or whatever it is that I'm trying to promote in my school, and then I would see if it had the effect that I wanted it to have. And then this is applied research because we're actually dealing with something directly. And then the result of that research would then help me make some decisions about how to spend the money. So it's directly applicable to a real world situation. It's not to understand some phenomenon of interest, but instead here we're trying to solve some problems. So I have some money. I don't want to just waste taxpayers' money from this grant that I got. I want to make sure that I'm using it in an appropriate way. I want to be able to justify perhaps my use of those funds. Right? If someone asks me, how do you know that it's going to be effective? I can show them some data. So this is more of the applied research type. So you can think about whether or not you want to propose basic research or applied research. Generally, we have students proposing basic research just to understand some phenomena of interest that they're interested in, but applied is also an option if you're interested in that. In order to identify a problem that's appropriate for research, we want to address an important question. We want to know, is this research going to make a difference? Is it going to contribute to what it's already known? Is it redundant, or is it a replication, right? We don't want to just be redundant. We want to perhaps replicate and enhance our understanding. So what we really want to do is advance the frontiers of knowledge. That's the goal of research, leading to new ways of thinking, suggesting new applications to something that's been previously used, paving the way for future research in the field. As we talked about, the research process is cyclical, right? So it's always evolving, informing future research based on previous research, etc. So we want to know whether or not this is a suitable research problem, and this is something that you want to think about as well. So select a research problem that's more than just for self-enlightenment, just because you're curious, right? It's more than that. It's contributing to something bigger than just yourself. It's more than just comparing two sets of data. We really want to contribute something new, identify or interpret some type of relationship. It's much more than a yes or no answer. Does this happen? Yes or no, right? We want to understand the phenomena of interest, the factors involved, what kind of controls need to be in place, what other factors might influence our variables of interest. All right, so where do we have a source of inspiration, let's say, for a legitimate research problem? Well, one is look around you, right? So not just look around you, perhaps it's look around you in your work environment. What are some patterns that you've seen? Let's say maybe if you work in a treatment center and you've seen some patterns that, you know, your patients coming into the treatment center tend to come from, you know, this type of family background or from this type of home environment. And you want to see if there's a connection there, or, you know, when you encourage them in a certain way, it's been really effective in your experience, and you want to see if that could be replicated with a larger group and would it have the same effectiveness. So you look around your own environment for inspiration, read the literature, of course. Also, going back to look around you, also look around in the media. The media is a great source of inspiration, I know for myself in my research. To think about what are some current trends, what's, you know, something that the general public is really curious about, wants a solution to a problem. And then in that way, then you see what's current, and then you see, well, is that something that perhaps I'm interested in, right? Because as I also have here, choose a topic that intrigues you or motivate you. The last thing you want to do, especially if you're going to actually carry out this research study, this is always said when you're thinking of a thesis or a dissertation topic, pick something you actually like, right? You don't want to get into a research project and invest all this time and energy and read everything about it and not even like the topic, right? So you want something that intrigues you, that motivates you, that gives you that drive to want to learn more yourself. Another one, attend professional conferences, and this also goes along with seeking the advice of experts. I've been to conferences, for example, AERA, and I met some leaders in the field, and just talking to them about their research and getting a springboard for my own research and the kinds of things that I might be interested in doing. Also choose a topic that others will find interesting, worthy of attention, which is what I was talking about with the social media, and what kinds of things are popular, and what are some hot topics that not only you would be interested in, but others would be as well. Okay, stating the research problem. You want to state the research problem clearly and completely. You want to be, remember we talked about that concept of the principle of parsimony. You want to keep it simple, but at the same time, you don't want to oversimplify it that you did not touch upon all of the relevant components. So make sure that you're stating the problem clearly. Stating the problem clearly also takes into account your audience. So who is your audience? And is this comprehensible to your audience? Did you define all your terms and explain it in a way that they understand? Think about the feasibility of the project. A lot of times we might be interested in something, but it's just not feasible to carry out. It would just take too long, be too expensive. Perhaps the gatekeepers, like let's say we're interested in a prison population for a research study. Well, we need to have access to the prison. There might be some laws in place that might limit the types of research that we do. IRBs, the Human Subjects Review Boards of any institution, would limit some of the things that we could do. Ethical considerations. So think about, is this project actually feasible. Like one of the classic examples I like to talk about when I give examples of causation and why cigarette companies are allowed to say, well, we don't know for sure that cigarettes cause lung cancer, for example. And the reason for that is because it's unethical to carry out a research project that would test that hypothesis. So to test that hypothesis, we would have to assign a random group of people to smoke and a random group of people to not smoke, and then see what happens after 20 or 30 years. And so then, as you can imagine, a researcher assigning a group of people to smoke when we know that it could potentially cause lung cancer is unethical. So it's something that we can never, that the feasibility is not there. The ethical considerations need to be taken into account. So that might be something you want to take into account as well. Say precisely what you mean. Don't try to be too lofty in the way you explain it. Be precise. Again, the principle of parsimony. Honesty and integrity are always the rule, not just in stating your problem, but also later in interpreting your findings. Have an open mind about the solution. So a lot of times we will go into a project with a certain idea, and then as we're reading the literature, it's leaning us in another direction, and that might not be the direction we wanted to go into. Well, we need to have an open mind, right? That once you've tapped into that literature, and now, there are some other perspectives we need to take into account based on some studies and some findings. We can't just simply ignore those studies. That would be unethical to do so. So be honest and carry out your research projects with integrity, even if we do come across a finding that perhaps even contradicts our hypothesis, our initial hypothesis. We need to take all the information that we have into account. So having an open mind is extremely important, and that goes along with integrity and honesty as well. And then, of course, with editing your work, edit it according to new information that you receive, whether it's during the course of your literature review or, after you have your findings, you have to edit and say, okay, well, we initially proposed this, but the data demonstrate perhaps something else. Sometimes we need to divide the problem into subproblems. So you don't want to overcomplicate things by taking on something that's just too massive. For example, I had some undergraduate students who were working on a research project, and they had so many variables that they were interested in looking at. They were doing an observational study of behaviors related to civility, and they were looking at whether or not drivers would yield at a crosswalk to pedestrians, and so they wanted to know, the gender of the driver, the gender of the pedestrian. They wanted to know, but at the same time, they wanted to look at the type of car, and so they wanted to do too many things simultaneously, and it overcomplicated it and made it very difficult to interpret their findings because they were trying to do too much at once. And so sometimes we need to identify subproblems. What's most important to you here? Is it really the make of the car, or is it the gender? Are we interested in the gender of the driver, the gender of the pedestrian? And then we identify what is the real problem of interest that we're looking at here. And then we may have several hypotheses that we would like to investigate further, but keeping in mind the principle of parsimony. Because if you overcomplicate your hypothesis, you're going to overcomplicate the way in which you interpret it. And then it's not going to be clear and concise to your reader, and it's not really contributing to the body of literature if it's overcomplicated and not comprehensible to the audience that you're targeting. So think about those as well. So always, again, going back to the principle of parsimony, keeping it simple, simplifying it, not overcomplicating it is the key. And sometimes we just need to call this going back to the basics, right? We're used to iPads and technology. I write all my notes on my iPhone, and I'm sure you all have different ways that you utilize technology as well to simplify things in your own life. But sometimes it's nice to just take a pencil to paper draw it out, map it out, draw some kind of flow chart, how our variables related to one another, get it all down on paper. If you have a marker board, maybe a marker board would help. But paper and pencil, just write it down, highlight the words to explore, reorganize the ideas, get it all down on paper. Sometimes going back to paper and pencil helps us sort through as we're brainstorming and trying to find out what we want to study. We also need to identify any types of problems. There are pseudo-subproblems, procedural issues that we need to identify, and making sure that we anticipate problems that are coming up and do our best to resolve any problems before they begin. So let's say, for example, I'm interested in looking at the differences between study strategy and the score on a test. So I I teach half of my participants a study strategy, and then half the participants, I don't give them any strategy. I tell them to study some material, and then I give them a test. And then I compare their results. Well, let's say that one of the rooms was really cold that day. Let's say the ones who got no study strategy, and they were just all freezing and uncomfortable, and so they took the test. But now I know that they were all freezing and uncomfortable, and it was because of the temperature of the room, and that might have affected the results. So I need to take into account any potential problems that could come up in my study, anticipate them, and resolve them before they even begin. We also need to delineate our problem. We have to establish a hypothesis a priori. That means before we begin. What is not ethical is to gather data and then say, oh, based on this data, let's make up some research questions, and oh, they happen to be statistically significant. That's completely unethical and inappropriate. We need to think about our hypotheses before a priori, before we collect our data, before the fact. In doing so, we identify specific variables. We're going to talk about something called operationalizing those variables. We need to define the terms in our study. So, for example, and this is particularly important in the social sciences, to say, okay, how do I define depression? Well, in this study, I defined depression as such and such. And so then I give my full explanation, my definition. And you'll notice that in different studies, they might define depression slightly differently, or anxiety, self-esteem, any of these constructs. We have to be very specific about the ways in which we define them in this study, and that's the process of operationalizing a variable. And operationalizing variables has two parts. One is defining it, you have to have some basis, and the second part, based on the previous literature, and the second part is how we're going to measure it. So in this study, we define depression as this, and we're going to use this scale or this measure or this questionnaire to measure depression. So we define it and we explain how we're going to measure it. That's developing an operational definition. We have to state any assumptions and delimitations. Okay, so as I stated, a priori, before the fact, we need to identify our hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess that researchers hope their data might support. We have to recognize the null hypothesis. So let's say if our hypothesis was there's a difference in male and female anxiety for the test. Well, our null hypothesis is that there is no difference. So always recognizing the null hypothesis, that's stating there is no pattern or there's no difference on the data. Scientists always support a hypothesis when they have statistical significance. But we never, and here's a really important point, we never prove our hypothesis. We only say that we have this data to support our hypothesis. We either reject or fail to reject the null, but we never adopt the hypothesis, even if we have statistical significance. We just simply say that we have data to support this hypothesis. It's never proven. And that's a really important distinction. Identifying our variables, we started talking about this. This is identifying what constructs we have of interest. In quantitative research, where we're dealing with numerical data. Quantitative research, we're talking about numerical data. We'll talk more about that later this semester. But here we have to say, again, how are we defining it, and then how are we going to measure it? There might be a particular way in which we code scores, and so we need to make sure that we explained each of those procedures that we take to develop a score. So how do we come up with a depression score? How do we come up with an anxiety score? And we need to specify that. We also need to identify appropriate research design and statistical analysis. The way in which we set up our variables then indicates what type of research design or statistical analysis you can actually conduct. Now, although we're not talking about, particular statistical procedures in this course, you have a whole other stats course for that if that's something that you're going to take. But we can begin to think about the way in which we set up our variables will then impact the way in which we can analyze our variables. And that's a really, really important consideration that cannot be overlooked. So one of the things that we need to know is, and here's a basic way, like a beginner's way to think about it, is do we have data that is categorical, or do we have data that's quantitative? So for example, males and females, well, we have two groups. There's some types of analyses that we can do with that. We can do some comparisons. One example that you may or may not be familiar with is called a t-test. A t-test compares two groups, but then we need another variable which would be what we call our dependent variable, and say, okay, our independent variable would be gender, but what's our dependent variable? How would we go about comparing, what is our variable of interest that we want to compare? So let's go back to anxiety for the test, and that can be our dependent variable. And then we can say, okay, our independent variable is gender, and our dependent variable is anxiety for the test. And we can utilize a t-test, which would be an appropriate statistical analysis. Now, let's say I'm taking a course and I'm supposed to run a correlation. And correlation is looking at the relationship between two variables. Well, correlation, you need two continuous variables. And because gender is a categorical variable and anxiety for the test is a continuous variable, I don't have two. So I couldn't conduct a correlation. And I could conduct a t-test, but not a correlation. So as you actually move forth in conducting your studies, if that's something that is required of you or that you're going to go on to do, one thing that for those of you who are going to actually conduct these studies, I really want you to think about the way in which you set up your variables and the types of analyses that it will allow you to conduct. And so, again, you would have needed to take that stats course to fully understand this particular piece of the puzzle. But just I hope that you'll remember this later on if that's something you're doing moving on. Really be careful about the way that you set up your variables. I'll give you another example. So gender, it has to be categorical. But sometimes there are variables that can be one or the other. So for example, and I've had students do this by mistake, they're conducting a study and they want to look at the correlation between income and, let's say, income and happiness. Okay, so let's say we have a quantitative measure of happiness, so a score from 0 to 100. And income we know is also continuous, right? We can have $0, zero income, up to, however many thousands of dollars. But let's say on my survey, I created categories for my income. And you see this a lot on surveys. You can kind of picture, how much money do you make? I make from 0 to 5,000, from 5,001 to 10,000. And then you have these categories and you have to check one. Well, if you set up your variable that way, then it's no longer a continuous variable. Now you took this variable that could have potentially been a continuous variable and you've converted it into a categorical variable, and that's very problematic. So again, it's not something that most of you need to worry about right now, but especially if you're going to conduct this study, I just need to reiterate how important it is to set up your variables appropriately, taking into account what type of statistical analysis you will eventually conduct. Okay, so a variable is any quality or characteristic in a research investigation that has two or more possible values. So I've been already talking about independent variable and dependent variable. Here are some definitions. An independent variable, a researcher studies a variable as a possible cause of something that you manipulate. Now that's the definition of the term, potential cause, but a lot of times we use our independent variable just as a comparison. You know, we're comparing like male and female, we're not looking at cause. But independent variable could be, you know, the other example that I gave you, study strategy or no study strategy. That could be the independent variable. The dependent variable depends on the independent variable. So in our example, that was, give you a second to think about it on your own. Do you remember what that was, that difference between males and female? Between study strategy and no study strategy, we're looking at test performance. So our dependent variable, we're saying that our test performance will depend on whether or not they had the study strategy. So that's how we set up our independent variable and dependent variable. Now, that's more of like an experimental, quasi-experimental design where you're making comparisons based on the IV or independent variable. But also know that there are other studies, such as correlational studies. We're looking at, you know, what potentially could be two dependent variables, right? There's no distinction in correlation. And so they could both be depend on each other, right? And we say as one goes up, the other goes up, or as one goes down, the other goes up. And so that might be a different design as well. An example of a study that we can conduct in looking at IVs, independent variables, and DVs, dependent variables. Here's a simple one. We can say, what is the difference in the consistency of ice cream by the temperature at which it is stored? The independent variable, we can create categories. So let's say our category 1 is hot, category 2 is room temperature, category 3 is cold temperature. So those are our 3 conditions. And then our consistency of ice cream, let's say we have some scale. Lower on that scale, closer to 0, means it's more liquid. Higher on that scale is more solid. And then we can have an average consistency of ice cream score, so a mean for each of those 3 groups. And then we'll compare those 3 groups. And we find that higher temperatures cause ice cream to melt, namely the lower consistency of ice cream, whereas low temperatures cause the ice cream to be solid, aka higher ratings of consistency of ice cream. And again, we would say that we would have data to support that hypothesis, but never prove the hypothesis. Another type of relationship you can have is what's called a mediating variable. Mediating variables help explain why an independent variable has a particular effect on the dependent variable. Independent variables sometimes influence what's called a mediating variable, which comes in between, which that mediating variable then in turn influences the dependent variable. So let's look at some examples. So let's say we are interested in a mediating variable. We can say, well, confidence level, effort, and performance. So confidence level is our independent variable, but our effort is our mediator. So that there's an impact on effort, which then leads to performance. So I can be really confident, but not necessarily perform well. So confidence, the relationship between confidence and performance is mediated by the amount of effort that we put in. So it's not just that confidence influences performance, but it's the amount of effort mediates that relationship. So high confidence with more efforts, you have great performance. Low confidence with less efforts, you have okay performance. But we know that even high confidence with low effort, we wouldn't have great performance, right? That the mediating variable in this case is effort. Another type of relationship we can look at is what's called a moderating variable. A moderating variable influences the nature and strength of relationship between the IV and the DV. Let's look at an example of this one as well. A moderating variable is that two things work together to influence the other variable. So for example, family income during childhood influences problems later in life. We can say, well, is there a moderating variable? And we can say, yes, perhaps maternal warmth is a moderating variable. So low income but high maternal warmth leads to fewer problems later in life, because even though they had low income, they had high maternal warmth, so therefore they had fewer problems later in life. We can say low income with low maternal warmth, they have more problems. But we can also see that high income, so even if you have high income, but your mom, you have low maternal warmth, then you're still going to have more problems. So here the case is that there's a moderating impact of maternal warmth. The income does not influence maternal warmth, right? So there isn't a relationship between the IV of income and maternal warmth, but that the combination of the IV with the moderator influences the dependent variable, which is problems later in life. So it's the combined effect. Defining terms. Here's where we talked about the operational definition. Each term should be defined as it will be used by the specific researcher. And if you recall, what I said was that an operational definition has two parts. One part is how we define that variable, and the other part is how we measure that variable. So it's definition of a characteristic or variable, how it will be measured in the research study. So not only the definition, but also how we'll measure it. And that's important in defining your terms for your research study. How do you, what we say, operationalize your variables for your study? Here are some examples. Self-confidence. Score on self-report questionnaire that has items such as, I can usually achieve what I set out to do, and I think of myself as a smart person. Popularity, number of peers who specifically identify an individual as being desirable social partner. So we can specify, sometimes the definition and the measurement are intertwined, such as in popularity, but we have to specify the key elements and how we're going to define it. One of the things that we want to do in research is to make sure that we are limiting any biases that we may have. So we're all human, we have biases. We came into the research project with certain ideas about how it's going to play out. And so one of the things that we need to do is to be really honest with our audience about anything that might have biased our development of the research problem and later our interpretation. So what are our assumptions? We need to state those openly. All assumptions that have material bearing on the problem should be openly and unreservedly set forth. So, the basis of our research study is this, our literature review is this is what led us to believe that there'd be a relationship here, these are the data that we found, and this is how we analyze the data, and based on these analyses, this is how we interpret it. The statement of the assumptions is necessary so others can evaluate our conclusions. So instead of just jumping to the conclusions, how did you come up with those conclusions? What was your starting point? What was your process, and how did you interpret your results? It also may state to the audience, what did the researcher take for granted? What did they not take into account? So you have to state all your assumptions. And then the audience can make their own decisions about your interpretations of the findings. We also want to identify our delimitations. Delimitations are statements about what the researcher is not going to do. The researcher must distinguish between what is and what is not relevant to the problem. So for example, I was recently at a student research presentation, and they had a study, and they were looking at some measures of religiosity and, interaction with children. And they said, well, what do you think about when children do this? And it was something completely off the cuff, not related to their research project. And they were being asked a series of questions about that. Well, what do you think about this? And, well, the student was a little flustered because they obviously didn't have an answer to that question. They hadn't studied it. They didn't do a literature review on it. They had no basis to answer that question. And, I talked to her afterwards and I said, sometimes there'll be people in your audience who will just ask you questions because they're interested in them. They may not be related to your study at all. But one of the most important things you need to learn to do is to specifically say, that's a wonderful question. I'd be interested in that as well. Unfortunately, it was not the area of this particular research study. If you start responding to that question, then the assumption to the audience is that you've studied that area and that you're familiar with it, or that's the basis of either your literature review or your actual study. And when you're standing presenting a research study and they're asking you about something else and you start answering it, the assumption is that you have a knowledge base to answer that question. So be really specific, whether in the written form or even presenting it verbally to an audience. Make sure that if you're responding based on a research study that you have a basis by which to respond. It's not just your opinion or what you think is the reason that that may be happening. We also want to establish the limitations of our study. So what are some limitations of our current study? So perhaps a limitation could be, well, it's a small sample. Or we don't always have a representative sample, even though we try as hard as we can. Maybe we overrepresent males or overrepresent females or overrepresent a particular group of individuals that does not reflect our sample. So we need to be very careful about saying, okay, these are our findings. However, one of the limitations is that this is a small sample. One of the limitations is that it's not representative completely of the population, and that may have influenced our results. Okay, so in your first proposal, and think about this for your assignments that you have, you should outline the problem, its setting. So, for example, let's say I want to know about children's activity level. Well, the setting is going to make a huge difference. Are we looking at children's activity level in a classroom? There's certain expectations for what that should be. Are we looking at on a playground? There's certain expectations of what activity level should look like there. So the setting, so not only the problem, the setting, also the population. I want to add that. Who are you interested in studying, right? We're looking at activity level of elderly, or we're looking at activity level of 5-year-olds. There's a huge difference in what we may find, and definitely a difference in our expectations. Subproblems, consider all the subproblems. A priori hypothesis, not after you've collected data. That's not an appropriate time point to develop hypotheses. They need to be done before you collect data. All your variables of interest, and also those operational definitions that we discussed. Assumptions, delimitations, limitations, and the importance of the study. Once you've put that together, now you got to evaluate your proposed research project. Have you conducted thorough research of the literature? Sometimes there are other related fields. So for example, I was studying female adolescent relationships. And because I was looking at relationships, I not only leaned to the psychological literature and the developmental literature, but I also looked at sociological literature and literature in communications. So that all influenced my final lit review, and that's something that you want to think about as well. Don't just look in one subfield, even though that's your main field. Also extend yourself to related disciplines so that you really have a full picture of the topic of interest. Look at it from all angles so that you minimize unwanted surprises. You never want to find out later, oh, I should have thought about that. Hindsight's always 20/20, as they say. So try your best. There's always going to be some, hiccups that come up along the way, especially in your first study, but try to anticipate as much as possible. Ask questions from others in the field so that you can make sure that you can avoid some of those unwanted problems. And be really specific about what research procedures you'll follow. Think about what research tools are available for you to use. That might even be, a tool as in a program to collect data. analyze data. Can others read and understand your proposal? Again, thinking about your audience is always key. Fine-tuning your research problem. Again, we want to conduct a thorough lit review, see problem from all sides, think about the process, discuss your research problem with others, all things that we've discussed already, and remember that your project will take time. So plan accordingly, especially if you're actually conducting this. And remember that the first draft of your proposal will always, most certainly not be your last. If any of you are going through the thesis or dissertation process, you will see this. You will go propose your study, probably have gone through many revisions with your advisor, present it to committee, and there'll be lots more revisions. In the same way, I will help you with revisions and feedback as you're going through the assignments. So what's your assignment? Not a formal assignment to hand in, but just assignment in terms of thinking about the assignments that you will be handing in. This is a good time to narrow down your topic of interest. Your assignment due date's coming up closely, so be sure to look out for that as well. Narrow down your topic. Who is your population of interest? So who are you interested in studying? What variables are interested in measuring? Also think about those operational definitions. Identify your hypothesis or research question. And now is a great time to get started on your literature review if you have not done so already. And that's chapter 2. As always, email me if you have any questions.